The atmosphere inside the congressional committee room was suffocating, heavy with the sterile glare of C-SPAN cameras and the immense weight of a political reckoning 8 years in the making. Senator John Kennedy had just placed a singular piece of paper on the polished mahogany table, a federal immigration document retrieved from 1995. It was a stark bureaucratic form that bore two specific names meticulously written on the exact same line, permanently bound within the exact same family unit. This was the very document Representative Ilhan Omar had spent the entirety of her meteoric political career swearing to the American public did not exist. Kennedy read both of those names aloud, letting the syllables echo ominously off the wood-paneled walls. And since that precise moment, the typically outspoken Congresswoman has not uttered a single public word. To truly understand the gravity of this total silence, one must first recognize the practiced posture of defiance that preceded it. Before the collapse, Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table with her back rigidly straight, her chin held perfectly level, neither tilted upward in a brazen, theatrical dare, nor bowed downward in quiet concession. It was the calculated, unflinching geometry of a person who fundamentally understands that in the theater of Washington, the precise angle of one's head is a powerful statement in itself. Her hijab was wrapped and adjusted with a flawless, geometric precision that left absolutely no fold unaccounted for, while her hands rested on the table at perfectly equal distances from the microphone, looking as though she had meticulously measured the space between them. This hearing is not about oversight, she had declared earlier, her voice lacking raw volume but carrying a razor-sharp, lethal edge. It is about a Muslim woman, a black woman, a refugee who came to this country with nothing and built a life that terrifies the people sitting across from her. Every single syllable she delivered arrived with the clean, deadly edge of a blade that had been repeatedly sharpened on the exact same stone. She had leaned aggressively into the microphone, delivering a heavily rehearsed defense mechanism explicitly designed to shame her conservative inquisitors. Every time they cannot defeat my ideas, they attack my identity, my marriage, my family, my faith. She stated, her gaze intentionally bypassing Senator Kennedy to stare directly into the camera positioned to the far left of the dais. It was the classic, impenetrable playbook, she insisted, the same one her political enemies had always utilized against marginalized voices. And her strategic choice of where to look was a deliberate broadcast to her political base rather than a conversation with the investigative panel. I am not afraid of these questions because I have answered them for 8 years, she boldly proclaimed, her tone dripping with practiced exasperation and moral superiority. The answers have not changed. The questions have not changed. Only the men asking them have changed. She had just confidently, arrogantly informed a United States Senate hearing that she had exhaustively addressed every single inquiry for nearly a decade. But sitting directly across from her, seemingly entirely unfazed by the rhetoric, Senator John Kennedy possessed a manila folder, and resting quietly inside that unassuming envelope was the one definitive, catastrophic document she had spent those exact 8 years furiously convincing the American public was a right-wing phantom. Now, that documentary evidence was resting openly on the table. Kennedy sat perfectly motionless, his hands politely folded together, his signature wire-rimmed spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose, and his folder entirely closed. Throughout her blistering, combative opening statement, the veteran lawmaker from Louisiana had not moved a single muscle, not a subtle shift of his hands, not a defensive roll of his shoulders, not an involuntary twitch of his mouth. The sheer, absolute, haunting stillness of the senator contrasted so violently with the aggressive, rhetorical sharpness of the congresswoman that the rising tension in the chamber required absolutely no broadcast narration. It was a physical, crushing weight that every single person present could clearly see and feel. Congresswoman Kennedy finally spoke. His deep, molasses-thick Southern drawl pitched at a volume so remarkably low and conversational that the frantic audio engineers had to desperately boost the microphone levels just to carry his voice through the speakers. You said you've answered every question for 8 years, and I take you at your word. So I'm just going to ask a few of them again, real quick, and you can give me the same answers you've always given, and we'll all go home. With a deliberate, agonizing slowness that stripped the air from the room, he flipped open the folder. He began laying down the chronological markers of an incredibly convoluted, deeply suspicious marital history. In 2009, you married a man named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. Is that correct? He asked calmly. She answered with a simple, clipped yes. Kennedy seamlessly continued, pointing out that 7 years prior to that legal union, in 2002, she had participated in a religious marriage ceremony with a completely different man, Ahmed Hirsi. She confirmed with a tight nod that it was indeed a faith ceremony. Kennedy then tightened the perimeter of the trap, establishing on the record that she was still fundamentally in that faith-based marriage with Hirsi when she formally legally tied the knot with Elmi in 2009. Omar immediately deflected, stating they had temporarily separated and that the 2002 ceremony held absolutely no legal weight, meaning no formal legal divorce from Hirsi, was technically required before marrying Elmi. It was a faith marriage, Senator. In my tradition, she explained, attempting to wrap her actions in the untouchable shield of cultural practice. Kennedy nodded slowly, his tone unfailingly, dangerously polite. I understand, ma'am. But the jaws of the trap were already rapidly closing. He smoothly pivoted to the years 2014 and 2015, noting that while she was still entirely legally bound in matrimony to Elmi, she had deliberately and illegally filed joint federal tax returns with Hirsi, a man she was entirely not legally married to at the time. For the absolute first time during the grueling hearing, a microscopic physical crack appeared in Omar's flawless facade. Her right hand twitched, moving precisely 1 inch toward her water glass before abruptly, awkwardly stopping. She quickly, defensively asserted that she had fully addressed the matter and that the fraudulent filings were subsequently corrected. Kennedy pounced with a devastating softness, reminding her that it was actually the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board that had discovered the severe violation, forcefully cornering her into the correction after you got caught. Now, Congresswoman, Kennedy murmured, delicately adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose and methodically turning a page. The atmosphere in the grand hearing room grew suffocatingly tight as Kennedy zeroed in on the absolute epicenter of the sprawling scandal. The central question, Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi, the man you legally married in 2009 and divorced in 2017. What is his relationship to you? She rigidly replied, her voice attempting to project absolute boredom that he was simply her ex-husband. Kennedy did not blink, nor did he break eye contact. Is he your brother? He asked. The blunt force of the unthinkable question echoing violently in the suddenly silent chamber. Omar's jaw visibly tightened, a microscopic clench of facial muscle detectable only to the seasoned reporters practically leaning over the press tables in the front row, and the unblinking lens of the high-definition camera positioned directly ahead of her. She immediately launched into her heavily fortified, pre-written defense, branding the inquiry as a disgusting lie perpetuated by bigoted blogs and Islamophobic conspiracy theorists who had ruthlessly targeted her since the very day she entered public life. Kennedy's volume did not rise a single solitary decibel. Ma'am, he interrupted gently, slicing straight through the political theater. I didn't ask you about blogs. I asked you a yes or no question. Is Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi your brother? When she snapped a sharp, defensive no, Kennedy let the inevitable, devastating follow-up hang, suspended in the dead air, hovering motionless like a baited fishing line over perfectly still water, waiting patiently for the unseen Leviathan lurking underneath to inevitably move and strike. Then why won't you release the documents that prove it? He meticulously dismantled her meticulously crafted narrative of right-wing victimization, pointing out with brutal precision that since 2016, she had been relentlessly pressed on this exact scandalous issue, not just by conservative operatives, but by serious mainstream journalists, federal investigators, fellow members of the congressional body, and most damningly, the Star Tribune, her own hometown newspaper in Minnesota. Not a conservative outlet, not a talk show. Your newspaper in your city, Kennedy, heavily emphasized. He methodically listed the glaring, inexplicable absences in her defense. In 8 long years of facing career-ending allegations, she had failed to produce a single birth certificate, a solitary family record, a basic immigration application, a family photograph identifying the relatives, or even a simple sworn affidavit from a living relative to clear her name. Pulling his glasses off and holding them in one hand with an absolute unshaking stillness, Kennedy delivered a devastating historical blow. He reminded her that the Star Tribune, the very liberal publication that had enthusiastically endorsed her political campaigns, had spent immense resources investigating this rumor and ultimately wrote in print in their own newspaper that they could neither conclusively confirm nor rebut the allegation that Elmi is Omar's sibling. Your own paper, Mrs. Omar, they tried to clear you. They could not because you would not give them the documents to do it, he stated, slipping the wire frames back onto his face. Leaning slightly into his folksy persona, he remarked that he was just a simple country lawyer who grew up in a local courthouse where the ruling judge knew everyone's mother and the metal filing cabinets reliably held more objective truth than any high-priced attorney in the room. And the thing I learned in that courthouse is this, Kennedy noted, his eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying clarity. When a person can make an accusation, go away with one piece of paper, one piece, and they choose not to produce that paper year after year while calling everybody who asks a bigot, well, everybody in the courthouse notices that, and they draw their own conclusions. Without giving her a fraction of a second to recalibrate, Kennedy pulled another crucial, devastating piece of evidence from his inexhaustible folder. He brought the timeline to June of 2012, shortly after the highly publicized birth of Omar's third child, directly referencing a public Instagram account definitively identified as belonging to Ahmed Elmi. Reading from a flat, starkly specific printout, Kennedy described a photograph posted by Elmi, a man independently verified by multiple sources, holding Omar's innocent newborn baby. Your baby, Mrs. Omar, Kennedy clarified, his tone utterly devoid of cheap theatrics. He peered over the upper rims of his glasses, his gaze piercing through the political noise. He noted that the caption Elmi deliberately chose for that intimate family photograph did not proudly proclaim my daughter. It did not politely say my stepdaughter, nor did it even casually use the infant child's actual given name. The caption said, nieces, Kennedy revealed, setting the printed digital screenshot down on the table with the agonizing, irreversible finality of a man dropping a key onto a counter after conclusively proving it unlocks a forbidden door. Nieces, that's what your husband called your newborn daughter, Mrs. Omar, he reiterated, intentionally letting the bizarre, incestuous reality of the word marinate in the painfully silent room. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the practical, undeniable authority of lived human experience. He stated that he had been walking the earth long enough to know that while husbands might organically call their daughters a myriad of affectionate, silly nicknames, princess, sweet pea, baby girl, the absolute last thing a father organically calls his own flesh and blood is his niece. The only person who calls someone's daughter nieces is that someone's sibling. That's what an uncle says. Not a father, not a stepfather, an uncle. Down in the crowded press, well, the entire dynamic of the room radically shifted. A seasoned, cynical reporter abruptly put down his smartphone and aggressively snatched up his notepad and pen. It was the universal, instinctual transition from casually recording a boring congressional hearing to desperately transcribing historical political destruction, because seasoned journalists instantly recognize when a spoken sentence is destined to be printed absolutely verbatim in tomorrow's front page headlines. Sensing the walls rapidly closing in on her carefully constructed empire, Omar forcefully shifted her weight forward, her manicured hands violently unclasping and reclasping as she desperately prepared a massive counteroffensive. When she finally spoke, her voice had not necessarily grown louder, but it had climbed significantly and uncomfortably in register, the pitch tightening excruciatingly like a industrial steel cable bearing an intolerable snapping load. She fiercely attempted to expand the battlefield, framing the surgical interrogation as a massive, systemic assault on marginalized people. What is happening in this room is what has happened to every Muslim, every refugee, every immigrant in this country since the 12th of September 2001. She fiercely declared, trying to summon the collective outrage of her progressive base. She furiously accused the committee of brazenly questioning their minority marriages, terrorizing their families, and fundamentally questioning whether they even belonged in America, furiously demanding why she was being brutally forced to prove her innocence in humiliating ways a white Christian member of the congressional body would never be subjected to. Her eyes swept aggressively across the expansive gallery, not in a cheap theatrical performance, but in a desperate, calculating inventory. She was furiously counting the sympathetic faces, desperately attempting to measure the remaining political oxygen left in the room. She pointedly and venomously noted that Senator Kennedy had never been harassed to produce his birth certificate, never been violently compelled to validate if his marriage was real, and never had his family's private immigration files aggressively audited for public inspection, because he is white, and he is Christian, and he is from Louisiana, and nobody in this country has ever questioned whether people like him belong here. She finished, her voice trembling with weaponized, righteous indignation. Up in the gallery, a liberal woman nodded in fierce, supportive agreement, while a Democratic staffer seated directly behind Omar noticeably straightened his spine, physically embodying the deep vertebral adjustment of a political operative who firmly believes their champion has just successfully permanently reclaimed the room's narrative. Kennedy, however, was an absolute master of the pregnant pause. He simply waited. He allowed the gallery woman's impassioned nod to complete its full arc. He allowed the young staffer's spine to comfortably find its triumphant new posture. He purposefully let the heavy, suffocating silence that trailed Omar's impassioned speech linger for one agonizing beat past its natural expiration. And then he let it sit for one beat more. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was chillingly, terrifyingly quiet, and that very quietness became the most deafening, destructive sound in the United States Capitol. "Ma'am," Kennedy stated softly, locking eyes with the Congresswoman, "I've never been accused of marrying my sister." 6 catastrophic, world-ending words. Up in the gallery, the woman who had just been nodding in fervent solidarity instantly froze. Her head did not naturally return to a neutral position. It simply locked mid-motion, trapped in a paralyzing limbo between agreement and profound shock, the unmistakable physical manifestation of a voter frantically recalculating their entire reality. Having entirely neutralized her emotional, racial defense with a single sentence, Kennedy mercilessly pivoted to the complex financial architecture of her personal life. "Let's talk about your current husband," he calmly announced, pulling out a fresh, significantly thinner stack of financial documents and meticulously squaring its edges against the table. He introduced the name Tim Minette, laying out the chronological timeline of their explosive relationship with the cold, methodical precision of a land surveyor driving property stakes into the ground, each stake clearly marking a severe ethical boundary that had been shamelessly trampled. Kennedy established for the absolute record that Omar's political campaign had officially hired Minette's political consulting firm, the E Street Group, back in 2018. He presented the staggering, undeniable figures. Between 2018 and 2020, her political campaign aggressively funneled more than $3 million in lucrative consulting fees directly into the firm's coffers. Kennedy brutally noted that precisely during this period of massive financial transfer, while the massive checks were actively being written, Omar initiated a deeply personal, romantic relationship with Minette. The horrific collateral damage was immediately entered into the congressional record. Minette's devastated wife, Dr. Beth Jordan Minette, filed for divorce in August of 2019, and in her sworn public legal filings, she stated under oath that her husband confessed he was abandoning his family specifically for Congresswoman Omar. Kennedy then rapid-fired the dizzying, legally perilous sequence of matrimonial musical chairs. Omar officially divorced Elmi in 2017, finalized a divorce from Hersey in 2019, and promptly married Minette in March of 2020. Crucially, Kennedy pointed out that the massive campaign disbursements to Minette's consulting firm did not remotely cease after the wedding bells rang. They actually accelerated. So your campaign paid your boyfriend's company $3 million, Kennedy summarized with brutal, folksy bluntness. Then you married him, and the payments kept going. In fact, Mrs. Omar, the E Street Group received more money from your campaign after you married its owner than before. He slammed the official Federal Election Commission filing onto the polished wood. That's not a consulting arrangement. That's a joint checking account with a logo on it. When Omar weekly desperately protested that the firm provided legitimate, verifiable consulting services and that the FEC had rigorously reviewed the filings, Kennedy swatted the pathetic excuse away with casual disdain. "The FEC reviews filings, ma'am. They don't investigate marriages," he retorted. To physically visualize the sheer scale of the scandal, Kennedy arranged 3 distinct pages side by side on the table, each sheet representing a completely different husband, each one explicitly carrying a massive dollar sign. He physically touched each paper as he delivered the ultimate, inescapable indictment. Marriage number 1, Ahmed Hersey. A religious ceremony with no legal record, which allowed you to legally marry another man without a divorce. Financial benefit. Joint tax filings with the wrong husband, he said, coldly tapping the first page. Marriage number 2, Ahmed Elmi. A legal marriage to a man your own newspaper cannot confirm is not your brother. Financial benefit? Immigration status? He continued, touching the second document. Marriage number 3, Tim Minette. A legal marriage to the owner of a consulting firm your campaign had already paid $3 million, he concluded, forcefully pressing the final page. 3 marriages, Mrs. Omar, 3 different men, and every single one has a money trail running through it like a wire through a wall. Folding his hands, Kennedy delivered a brutal, unforgettable colloquialism. "That's not a love life, Congresswoman. Where I come from, we'd call that a business model." For the absolute first time all morning, the flawless, camera-ready geometry of Omar's proud posture finally collapsed. Her chin physically dropped 1/4 of an inch, a catastrophic, highly visible deviation from the defiant stance she had rigidly maintained since her opening statement. A seasoned, eagle-eyed reporter in the second row instantly noticed this microscopic physical surrender yet actively chose not to write it down, intuitively understanding that some moments of utter political destruction are so profoundly human they must be held in the memory rather than cheapened by notebook ink. Then came the moment of absolute historical annihilation. Kennedy reached deep beneath the manila folder and slowly extracted a solitary, aged piece of paper. For the very first time that entire morning, he gripped a document using both hands, a subtle but glaring shift in physical body language that was immediately terrifyingly visible to the breathless gallery, because an interrogator who has casually handled damning evidence with one hand all day does not suddenly dramatically switch to two without a world-ending reason. Mrs. Omar, for 8 years you have told this country that the accusation about Ahmed Elmi is a disgusting lie, Kennedy began, his voice taking on the grim, inescapable solemnity of a judge reading a terminal sentence. You have called it Islamophobia. You have called it bigotry. You have said repeatedly, under oath and on camera, that no document exists connecting you and Elmi as members of the same biological family. Adjusting his glasses one final time, he dropped the absolute bombshell. He announced that the Senate committee had successfully obtained, via a strictly enforced federal record subpoena, an original immigration application explicitly filed all the way back in 1995 with the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service. It was a Form 130, a petition for an alien relative, legally filed on behalf of her exact family unit for the express legal purpose of family reunification. Kennedy began to read the fragile, yellowing page aloud. He read it with excruciating, torturous slowness, possessing the grim, absolute understanding that every single syllable he uttered was fundamentally, irreversibly destroying the political life of the woman sitting merely 12 feet away from him. Petitioner, your father. Application for reunification of family members, dependents listed for entry to the United States under the family reunification provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act. He began to officially read the list of names in exact sequential order, beginning with siblings, then proceeding to minor children. When he arrived at two specific names, he abruptly stopped reading, and that sudden, terribly heavy silence was infinitely louder than any accusation he had voiced all morning. Looking dead into her terrified eyes over the rims of his glasses, he spoke the names Ilhan Omar and Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. He gently laid the ancient, devastating 1,995 document onto the mahogany table, positioning it as the definitive anchor at the very end of his sprawling row of evidence, the tax fraud filings, the convoluted marriage certificates, the bizarre Instagram printout, and the millions in FEC disbursements. The timeline now possessed a concrete beginning and a catastrophic end. The genesis was 1,995, and the absolute destruction was today. Same application, same petition, same household, same family unit, Kennedy stated, letting the horrifying reality of the words sink in. He paused, drawing out the final seconds of her career before delivering the killing blow. Relationship to petitioner for both names, on the same line, in the same box. Siblings. A paralyzing, absolute silence descended upon the grand hearing room, and quiet so incredibly profound that the low, electrical hum of the fluorescent lights above the dais sounded like roaring jet engines. Somewhere deep in the packed gallery, a stunned spectator nervously shifted her weight, and the resulting creak of the wooden seat was the singular, isolated human sound in the entire chamber. Down in the press, a pen that had fallen to the carpet 20 minutes earlier lay completely abandoned, forgotten by journalists, entirely captivated by the live execution. For 8 years, Mrs. Omar, you have told this country, you have told this Congress, you have told the press, you have told the voters of the 5th District of Minnesota that this document does not exist. Kennedy practically whispered, his index finger tapping the aged paper with a rhythmic, damning finality. He listed her barrage of aggressive excuses that the allegation was a disgusting lie, that anyone who dared inquire was a racist bigot, that the mere question itself was rooted in rampant Islamophobia. He heavily tapped the page one final time. The document exists. It has been sitting in a federal filing cabinet in a records warehouse since 1995, he declared, twisting the knife. Since before you were elected to anything, since before you became a citizen, since before anyone in this room knew your name. And it says in black ink on a government form filed by your own father that you and Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi are brother and sister. Not husband and wife, not strangers, brother and sister on the same form in your father's handwriting. Across the table, Omar was entirely, utterly paralyzed. Her mouth opened a fraction of an inch, the absolute beginning of a defensive shape, the first millimeter of a rehearsed word that she had deployed 1,000 times before to successfully shut the door. It was the powerful word that began with I and ended with phobia, the magical incantation that had flawlessly operated for nearly a decade to make every threatening inquiry vanish into thin air. But this time, her mouth slowly closed, and the word died silently behind her teeth. The impenetrable identity shield that had violently protected her for 8 long years, a shield she had meticulously built, maintained, and violently swung like a bloody broadsword to mutate every legitimate question into a bigoted attack, completely shattered and stayed inside with it. It had finally collided with an immovable, terrifying object it simply could not slice through. A stark, unfeeling government form and bureaucratic paperwork absolutely does not care what horrific labels you hurl at them. In a gesture of profound defeat, her left hand slowly rose from the table, trembling slightly as it traveled toward her face. 2 manicured fingers came to a delicate rest against her lower lip, not overtly covering her mouth or desperately hiding it, but pressing lightly against the flesh. It was the universal, subconscious gesture of a trapped human being, physically holding back a terrifying truth that is screaming to escape the visceral reaction of a woman who had spent 8 triumphant years letting her words aggressively fly out, abruptly deciding for the very first time that she must desperately keep it in. Up in the gallery, the very same liberal woman who had nodded so passionately and vigorously during Omar's fiery opening monologue about terrifying the establishment was absolutely no longer looking at the Congresswoman. Her eyes were completely locked onto the devastating document, at the I-130, at the page resting on the table featuring 2 names on the exact same line. She was staring at it with the cold, clinical detachment of a person evaluating hard, undeniable evidence rather than blindly supporting the person the evidence belonged to. And that brutal shift in her gaze from the politician to the paper was in itself its own kind of damning, inescapable verdict. A federal immigration form from 1,995 listing Ilhan Omar and Ahmed Elmi as literal siblings, the exact same application, same family, same household. She had spent 8 years maliciously calling it a lie while the document sat entirely undisturbed in a federal warehouse the entire time. Senator Kennedy slowly rose to his feet, a towering figure of accountability, standing over the wreckage of a political empire. He began to slowly, methodically, walk the entire length of the sprawling witness table, and as he passed every single piece of documentary evidence, he touched it lightly with one extended finger, and each deliberate touch represented a chronological year, and each agonizing year represented a deeply corrupt transaction, 2002. A religious marriage to Ahmed Hersi, no legal record, touch, 2009. A legal marriage to Ahmed Elmi while still in a faith marriage to Hersi, touch, 2014, 2015. Joint federal tax returns filed with Hersi while legally married to Elmi, touch, 2017. Divorce from Elmi 8 years after the marriage. Touch, 2018. Legal marriage to Hersey. Finally, Touch, 2019. Divorce from Hersey. Touch, 2020. Marriage to Tim Minette. Your campaign had already paid his firm $3 million. Touch. He arrived at the final page, the damning I-130, and rested his finger on it significantly longer than the others. 1,995. A federal immigration form. Your name, Elmi's name, same line, same family, siblings, both of you. He turned his back to the gallery and stared directly into her soul across the vast, condemning expanse of white documents dividing them. 8 dates, 3 husbands, 3 money trails. And not one of these relationships, not a single one, exists without a financial transaction attached to it. Immigration benefits, tax fraud, $3 million in campaign funds. Kennedy indicted her with merciless precision. He picked up his reading glasses, folded them with an audible snap, and set them down firmly next to the 1,995 form. You called it Islamophobia, Mrs. Omar. For 8 years, every question was Islamophobia. Every journalist was a bigot. Every investigation was a witch hunt. And for 8 years, this piece of paper, he touched it one last definitive time, was sitting in a filing cabinet in a government warehouse, waiting for somebody to ask for it. Kennedy returned to his heavy leather chair, sat down, folded his hands tightly, and delivered 2 devastating words. Somebody asked. The committee chairman nervously cleared his throat, formally asking if the gentlewoman from Minnesota wished to issue a response. Omar slowly opened her mouth, uttering a choke. This is before instantly freezing again. It wasn't that the word was gone. The infamous defense mechanism was sitting right there, heavily loaded directly behind her teeth, completely primed to fire. It was the exact same ammunition she had blindly fired 1,000 times in 1,000 different rooms at 1,000 different inquisitors who had dared to approach this forbidden question: Islamophobia, bigotry, racist lies. The word desperately wanted out, violently fighting its way out the way a live bullet yearns to burst from a chamber. But the damning reality of Form 130 was staring right back at her black ink, official government letterhead, her father's verified signature, her name, and her brother's name permanently cemented on the exact same line. In that agonizing fraction of a second, she realized with the terrifying clarity of a cornered lawyer, a survival instinct honed over 8 years of choosing exactly the right word at exactly the right moment, that firing the word Islamophobia at a concrete government document would result in the word violently shattering upon impact. For the absolute first time in her meteoric, scandal-ridden career, playing the ultimate victim card would not make the terrifying question magically go away, because the question had evolved. It was no longer a theory, it was a verified form, and bureaucratic forms simply do not care what slurs you call them. Her manicured fingers returned to tremble against her lower lip, resting there in excruciating silence for 3 full seconds, then 5 agonizing seconds. Slowly, like a machine powering down, she lowered her trembling hand and placed it perfectly flat on the table right beside the other one. When her voice finally emerged from the microphone, it lacked all of its trademark sharpness, volume, and fire. In fact, it did not even sound like her own voice. It was the sterile, defeated tone of highly paid legal counsel, the robotic repetition of a deeply panicked lawyer who had grabbed her in a back room and strictly dictated exactly what to say if everything completely fell apart. It was a hollow sentence entirely memorized in advance for the catastrophic moment when all other lies utterly failed. "I have nothing further to say at this time," she whispered. 8 pathetic words constituted the absolute coldest, most chillingly formal sentence she had ever delivered in a public hearing. There were no fiery accusations of disgusting behavior, no screams of bigoted attacks, absolutely no progressive fire. There was merely the cold, hard reality of law, the pathetic sound of an untouchable politician instantaneously transforming into a terrified criminal defendant, broadcast live on high-definition camera in front of an utterly stunned nation. The catastrophic video clip broke the internet with the violent speed that only true political destruction can achieve, both the short and long versions acting as unstoppable forces. The severely truncated 4-5-second version featuring Kennedy reading the I-130 sibling checkmarks, immediately followed by Omar's terrified finger on the lip silence, racked up an unfathomable 55 million views before the sun had even set on the Capitol. The institutional fallout was immediate and utterly devastating. The Department of Justice released a terrifying statement announcing it was aggressively reviewing the 1,995 immigration application in direct consultation with the Department of Homeland Security, while the notoriously sluggish House Ethics Committee simultaneously triggered a formal, sweeping investigation into Omar's labyrinthine tax filings and the massive campaign disbursements secretly funneled to the E Street Group, abandoned by her usual media defenders. A panicked spokesperson for Omar's rapidly collapsing office issued a pathetic one-sentence statement that essentially screamed absolute guilt through its deafening silence. The Congresswoman is reviewing her legal options. Over in the halls of Congress, Representative Nancy Mace, the South Carolina Republican who had previously been thwarted by both parties when she aggressively attempted to subpoena these exact immigration records back in January, took a brutal victory lap on social media, posting a singular, venomous sentence, "I told you so." The uniparty establishment had desperately tried to kill the subpoena, but somebody else had just violently ripped the drawer wide open. Far away from the marble halls of Washington, the true, agonizing human cost of the scandal was being deeply felt. That evening, in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Falls Church, Virginia, a legal immigrant named Amir sat completely motionless in the dark, watching the full 1-4-minute unedited massacre on his glowing laptop screen. Amir had legally emigrated to the United States from Iran 11 arduous years ago, enduring a grueling 7-year purgatory, desperately waiting for his elusive green card. He had survived 7 agonizing years of endlessly filling out complex forms, draining his savings on exorbitant fees, enduring humiliating biometric appointments, and surviving grueling interrogations by federal officers who purposely asked him the exact same questions 3 different ways just to see if his answers would accidentally change. He had meticulously filed every single I-130 and I-485 document, hoarded every vital receipt notice, and prayed over every single employment authorization renewal. He had sacrificed immensely to pay every massive fee which ruthlessly came due, whether he had the cash that month or not, and he had done absolutely everything perfectly in the exact legal order at the precise right time, because that was the sacred American deal. The promise was crystal clear. Follow the strict rules, wait your excruciatingly long turn in line, and this glorious country will eventually allow you to walk proudly through the front door like a respected human being. Now, sitting in the shadows of his apartment, he watched Omar's face on his screen, a woman who fundamentally hailed from a different country but had ostensibly walked the exact same terrifying path toward that exact same golden door. He watched Kennedy definitively read the irrefutable I-130 form featuring 2 names boldly printed on the exact same line, exposing the ultimate shortcut. And as he watched Omar's trembling fingers come to rest on her lip in defeated silence, Amir did not feel a sudden rush of explosive anger. Instead, he felt an overwhelming, soul-crushing exhaustion. It was the profoundly specific, bone-deep tiredness of a desperate man who had stood obediently in a bureaucratic line for 7 long years, painfully filling out legal forms by hand at his tiny kitchen table, completely terrified that one minor accidental wrong answer would instantly deport him back to the end of the line, only to watch a privileged, arrogant politician who had allegedly bypassed the entire sacred system spend 8 years maliciously destroying the reputation of anyone who dared to notice her fraud by calling them bigots. He slowly closed his laptop, letting the absolute quiet of his apartment consume him, a silence only broken by the distant hum of traffic out on Route 7, possessing an emptiness that absolutely nothing could fill. While Senator John Kennedy sat quietly on his Louisiana porch, reflecting on the cold metal filing cabinet that had just dismantled a political empire, a suffocating terror consumed a lavish Washington, D.C. apartment hundreds of miles away. Stripped of her fiery defiance, her weaponized accusations of bigotry, and her seemingly invincible political armor, Ilhan Omar sat entirely paralyzed across from her high-powered defense attorney. The miraculous, ruthless journey from a squalid refugee camp in Kenya to the untouchable halls of Congress had violently collided with a single, forgotten 1,995 immigration form left behind by her own father, 3 calculated marriages, 3 massive money trails, and 8 years of desperately screaming Islamophobia to silence an entire nation had all been instantly undone by one undeniable piece of paper. Suddenly, the frantic scratching of her lawyer's expensive pen stopped, plunging the dimly lit kitchen into an absolute, deafening silence. Snapping his legal pad completely shut, the attorney looked up with eyes entirely devoid of hope. He slowly slid a deeply confidential federal plea document across the polished mahogany table, tapped his index finger heavily on the final signature line, and leaned forward to whisper a single devastating question that would permanently alter American political history forever.